Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's hard in my experience with trying to like balance the in-game like live adjustments to this particular hand and balancing the view of this spot as something that will be represented in the aggregate as a stat, because like I want to be able to make an adjustment based on the nuances of this particular spot, right? Like this particular turn, this particular opponent, this particular timing, like all of the subtleties, like a more global picture of what's happening, but also not getting so lost in that I am still aware that, making too many adjustments will just like cause a stat. I don't know if I'm describing this well, but cause a stat to be just like totally out of whack, and grounding myself in both simultaneously. Do you kind of get the tension I'm describing here? And like, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like there's a tension between what you think your stats should be and what your actual, you've got a lot of different things factoring into whatever your decision is in the moment. And I guess what I would say is don't focus too much on what your stat should be. Like the idea that you should be like three betting 11%, that's not the kind of thing that I would want cluttering a student's thought process while they're playing. It's just not really like a actionable goal really in the moment. But the way that it would show up in ideally in your thought process, I think, is I point out that you have these leaks and I show you what your tendencies are. And then as you're playing, you might get to a spot that you feel is close. And hopefully at that point, if it's relevant, you will come back to, oh, I know that from my stat checker, I tend to make mistakes in this direction. Like I tend to not three bet enough. So if I feel like this is a close hand, maybe if I feel like it's a 25% three bet, well, maybe I should three bet at 50% because I know that I have this tendency to be too passive in this spot. So that's how you actually take your stats and you use them in the moment. I think generally anything that is like some far off, like vague goal, a long-term goal is probably not going to help you when you're actually playing poker in the moment.
Yeah, agreed. I think I'm curious this too, because when I typically when I'm looking at stats and the way it works into my thought process, the thought you just pointed out is really useful, which is to know like, okay, well, I know I'm typically like, there's weird connections. Like, let's say I know I'm typically under barreling turns on flop, thinking about like, am I betting enough hands or checking the right hands to like be doing this with or like whatever. But there's also, for me, the biggest part of my thought process is more how actively am I tuning into what I view are the mistakes of the pool and the players, which we kind of mentioned. And I've actually found that to have a greater impact on my shifting my stats than even my own concern about my own strategy. Like if I'm particularly dialed in well to the spots where people are doing things poorly, this may not be true for everybody because, like you described, some people might be too careful or too cautious. But typically, if I'm like, oh, this is just like a good spot to run a bluff, and as long as uh, I mean, some spots you don't have to be concerned with anything else other than that. That's it, and you just run every bluff. And I don't think that's every spot, but that is some spots.
I think most of the time that's right.
Yeah, yeah. Most of that you just run every bluff, or
Yeah, I mean, I would say the vast majority of the time, if you think you have a good exploit, you take that exploit and don't worry
right,
about
right,
anything
right.
else.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess there's a question to the environment and the people you're playing against and your own. Yeah, this would be. I put this to you because I I'm more in your camp, but I also feel like if you were to watch me play, I think people would think that that makes my game look more unhinged than it would if you were to watch me play. Whereas, on average, I'm in that camp generally, but I probably have some moderation and some restraint in spots where I'm like, I think this spot's overfolded, but I'm not quite sure, and I'm gonna lean this way. Um, but to be clear, we're coming from very different backgrounds. I spend very little time actually looking at like mass data. That's not a thing I do. I'm mostly focused on like what I think the data would show based on tendencies of players and stuff like that. But do you find that you ever do you have any approach to moderation depending on the pool? Like if you're playing against the same kind of regs all the time, like do you have any kind of moderate approach to running exploits? Or
Yeah, and honestly, like I don't really spend much time looking at mass data these days either. Like with the stat checker, you don't really need it most of the time. Like you can just look at your pool stats, and if you're playing decent volume, you're going to have 500,000 to a million hands on your pool, and that's obviously much more valuable to have than like some other database because it's your pool, it's the players that you're playing against. I think as far as going with exploits, it just depends on how good your opponents are. So I think the only time that you would not want to go for an exploit is if you think you're up against a really strong perceptive opponent, and you could burn that exploit. Another more subtle thing that can happen is let's say you're up against a really good player who likes to cause chaos. Some players are really good at um, just pushing like the aggression subtly in every spot. And so you might be up against like a very elite player who just check raises too much on the flop. And you could say, okay, I know how to exploit the player who's check raising too much on the flop. I'm going to do that. But now you try to counter that, and now you're off from the flop. You've deviated from your core strategy. And some of these players are so good at doing this that's actually their goal, is that they just want to get you off, just out of your comfort zone, in no man's land, and they're just going to outplay you on the turn and river. So I think you want to be conservative based on how good and perceptive your opponent is that you're playing against. Obviously, if you're just up against a recreational and you have an exploit, there's like no reason to ever pass it up. But if you're up against an elite player, that's where you might have to be a bit more careful and just fall back to theory more often.
do you bring in any moderation though to your own confidence of said exploit? Because you obviously could look at any line and have an idea of what's like, because I guess there's two kinds of exploits, right? There's exploits that we've sort of built a strategize around based on the data we've seen in our pool, based on like basically like before showing up in the game, strategies we've built, right? But then there's exploits that are like, okay, this river I think is a particularly this river is more likely to be overfolded than most rivers, I think. And maybe in this line, this wouldn't be that overfolded a spot, but I think this river shifts things. And do you approach, but in that spot, I could just be wrong. My opponent could read that as a river where they might overfold and the result could cause them to overcall, or, there's all kinds of ways that this might go. Do you approach exploits like this with moderation, where do you allow for any kind of uncertainty strategically, where you're like, okay, well, I'm not quite sure, so I'm not always going to hard exploit every spot where I think someone might be doing something wrong, independent of their skill level?
Yeah, I think that your understanding of theory is how you hedge this. Like ideally, if you understand the theory of the spot, you're not going to be making any big pure strategy errors. Like if you have a hand that is just a bluff, in theory, you bluff it. If you have a hand that's a very poor bluff, in theory, you check it, but then you have a lot of hands in your range that are close. And those are the types of hands that you have the liberty to go with your exploits more. And so, like, this is what I like about poker is the exploits and the theory really bleed together in this way. And as you get better with theory, you'll get better with exploits because you just know better when you're free to take them.
Many people relate to their own minds as a dangerous place. They move carefully, quietly. They know that if they move too far into unfamiliar, harsh territory, something could rise up they're not ready to face. To begin meditation is to make a different choice. It's to make the decision to be an adventurer, a warrior, to hold the aspiration that there will one day be no place in your own mind that you are too afraid to visit. This is what meditation is for. And this is what my program in 2026 is about. Click the link below to learn more. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. The full episode airs this Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Stay tuned and please like and subscribe and turn on your notifications so you hear when it goes live.